In order to help fund many of his wild speculations over the past 9 to 10 years, he'd mortgaged the Tabor Block and the Tabor Grand Opera House in Denver, both of which he was now losing to court-ordered foreclosure actions, along with virtually all of his Leadville holdings, including his dear Tabor Opera House on Harrison Avenue. Baby was selling off her jewelry to try to stave off creditors. She even went to her brother Peter McCourt, now modestly financially sound and in great part successful due to Horace and Baby. But even Baby's favorite brother told her he didn't have enough money to help them out. And worse yet, that even if he did, he wouldn't give it to her anyway. She and Horace would just fritter it away like they had their own money over the last 10 years. Later, Baby would refer to this episode with Peter as the worst disappointment of her life. She did not know it at the time, but she had sadly underestimated her brother. It seemed things had come down to Baby and Horace against the entire world, as lawsuit after lawsuit was filed by the list of creditors now swooping in to grab what little was left of the Tabor Empire. Even the utilities were shut off, and by 1896 the Tabor family was living by candlelight in their huge, dark, and cold Sherman Street mansion. But to their credit, the two stuck together, and with the truth finally hitting them square in the face, they began to realize just how serious their plight was. On April 3, 1899, while at work, Horace was seized with an appendicitis attack. He tried to ignore the pain, but finally could stand it no longer. He was taken home to the Windsor by cab, and a doctor was called. Physicians were hesitant about operating because of his age, 69 at the time. It didn't matter. Peritonitis quickly developed, and Tabor fell into a coma and remained that way, off and on, for 7 days, until on April 10, 1899, with Baby, Maxie, Lily, and Silver Dollar by his bedside, Horace Tabor, one of the nation's most famous and celebrated Silver Kings to ever have lived, passed into history. Alive, Tabor's wealth had allowed him to be surrounded by countless so-called friends, investors, business partners, and loyal family during his decade of glory. But when he slipped and fell into a life of poverty and had needed them so desperately, they were seldom seen. But now in death, as if the world had accepted his last days as a man who had finally turned the corner from his wild, robust, and scandalous days, many did return for a final tribute. Tabor's funeral was one Denver would not soon forget. Hundreds of telegrams poured into Baby from mayors, governors, and senators. Leadville had sent a huge floral arrangement over 6 feet high. After laying in state at the Capitol, state militia, police, and firemen marched down Broadway and 17th Street, and with thousands of spectators along the route, some reports claiming as many as 10,000, Tabor was moved to Calvary Cemetery and buried. Horace had left Baby with virtually nothing, not even a pension, and she now found herself on the streets of Denver, unemployed with a 14-year-old and a 9-year-old daughter to support. Now one more piece of humble pie was being served to a lonely and broken-hearted Baby Doe Tabor.
The story of Baby Doe Tabor is really two stories in one. The first, of course, being the story of her and Horace's climb to the pinnacle of financial success and living a lifestyle most of us can only dream about for over 10 glorious years. But part two of this amazing story may be even more intriguing than the first. Was there another Baby Doe we'd never met? We can only imagine the mental state Baby must have been in 1899 after she'd just lost everything in her life except her 2 daughters. And she was now faced with the day-to-day challenge of having to provide for them without her beloved Horace by her side and with hardly a penny to her name.
Baby was willing to take on housework for income, still adamantly refusing the advances of the many wealthy men always ready to take her in as a mistress or even wife, which easily would have secured for her and her daughters a financially comfortable life. But she remained forever faithful to her husband, regardless of his death. So much for the rumors of Baby Doe, the gold digger. It seemed the only thing she felt comfortable with was the past, and she was unable to let go of the hope that things might once again be as they were just a few years ago before the crash. She could not accept that an era was gone and move forward. Always the matchless mine stuck in her mind, and she became obsessed with regaining possession of it and bringing it back into production. She frequented Denver's financial district, contacting investor after investor in hopes of finding someone willing to help her reopen the Matchless. Whether Horace on his deathbed, and perhaps during one of his brief moments of consciousness, had ever uttered the fabled words, "Hold on to the Matchless, it will pay millions again," is unknown. Certainly the mine had long since passed from Tabor's possession, but it had been such a faithful little producer, perhaps the Tabors still owned it in their hearts, if not on paper. Baby Doe now looked back on her life and her past transgressions and began what most who knew her personally called 36 years of repentance. How badly Horace's death had shocked Baby Doe at the time is also unknown, but clearly she began to lose control of her sanity, perhaps in little bits and pieces at first, but there's no doubt that she would never again be the carefree and bubbly Baby Doe of high society ever again. Baby was living at the supply cabin at the Matchless full-time now, but she was clearly losing touch with reality. Although Mullen had a number of opportunities to lease the mine, he refused to evict Baby Doe. And as the Denver Post reported, that and Mrs. Tabor's eccentricities and the fact that she showed her rifle to any and all strangers who came near the property prevented any leasing arrangements from going through. The mine filled with water and remained unproductive. Baby Doe Tabor remained, year after lonely year, alone in the tiny cabin, living off small donations anonymously sent to her, and with the charity of Leadville merchants and friends who also felt sorry for her. She had long since gone to dressing in burlap wrapped around her legs with twine and a motorist's cap on her head. The world had seen the last of her fluffy blonde hair. In her long black dress and wooden cross tied around her neck, she lived on the meagerest of supplies. Until her death, her pride refused to allow her to accept charity openly, but merchants would often trade worthless hunks of ore from the Matchless for food, then throw the ore out the back door when she left. Baby wrote and spoke of spirits visiting her during her self-imposed isolation at the tiny Matchless cabin. Her visions and nightmares speak of what were obvious feelings of guilt for her past transgressions, and must have terrified her night after night, clear up to the very end.
June 13th, 1927. After I went to bed, I saw visions. I saw devils' faces, and then close at my right side stood a tall, thin man with a long, narrow, thin head. He had the most terrible devil eyes, oh so horrible. No earthly power could describe them. And the rest of his devil face was horror to look at or think of. His head, narrow and long, all of it, face, body, and all of him was a nasty yellowish color, all the same shade, a dull color, and so nasty. His eyes blazed. He was the real devil. He glared at me a few seconds. Then he vanished. He was wild with anger and rage. I knew it was Lucifer the devil. He only stayed a few seconds. Mrs. H.A.W. Tabor.
Finally, in late February of 1935, a vicious snowstorm blew into the area, leaving massive drifts of snow up Friar Hill and around the Matchless. By March 7th, namer Naomi Pointiers, publicly known as Sue Bonney, had not seen smoke coming from Baby's cabin for several days and tramped through the snow to the frozen cabin. Baby Doe's funeral was attended by and held at Leadville's Church of the Annunciation. Earlier, the body of Horace Tabor had been moved from the now abandoned Calvary Cemetery plot and relocated at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Denver. Within weeks of her death, Baby Doe's brother, Philip McCourt, made arrangements to have his sister laid to rest next to her beloved Horace.
It's here at the Mount Olivet Cemetery in Denver where Baby was finally reunited with her beloved Horace, and where they remain together today. Although Augusta left a sizable estate, estimated at about $1.5 million, she died lonely and remains that way today, where she's buried here at the Riverside Cemetery in Denver.